Hi, this is Brent, the Climate Guru, and in commemoration of Black History Month, let's have a discussion of environmental justice and environmental racism, how decisions to build factories, plants, drilling of oil wells, and other industrial activities affects people of color, and has done so for many years. A professor of urban planning and environmental policy, Robert Bullard from the University of Texas, said that in some ways it makes a kind of grim sense that the people most harmed by environmental hazards are the same people who are harmed by society as a whole. Chandra Taylor, a senior attorney and leader of the Southern Environmental Law Center, said part of that calculus involves zoning decisions. Polluting industries count on the communities they target to be powerless, and they count on people in powerful communities to pay no attention. Black Americans are exposed to more pollution from every type of source: industry, agriculture, vehicular emissions, construction, residential sources. If you go to communities of color across the country and ask them, what's the source of environmental problems? They can point you to every one of them. The highways built through their community, destroying traditional African-American communities, chemical plants built nearby, oil and gas refineries. The legacy of pollution left over from decades. It's in their houses, in the air, in the water, and in the playgrounds. Redlining is decisions made by federal government in the 1930s, where they created maps of cities, rating the riskiness of different neighborhoods for real estate investment by grading them as the best, quote, still desirable, declining, or hazardous. And race played a defining role in those designations of neighborhoods. Black and immigrant neighborhoods were typically rated hazardous and outlined in red, denoting redlining. And what the result was, it was a perilous place to lend money. Much of the wealth is developed over time through the ownership of the family home. And when people of color, Black families, cannot borrow, cannot finance, cannot get a mortgage for their home, it has a huge effect. Growth of wealth of the families. Savings of Black families over years is the main tool of family savings that can be transmitted to the next generations. Congress outlawed redlining by the 1970s, but the practice has left lasting marks on cities in communities of color. City planners targeted redline areas, cheap land for new industries, highways, warehouses, public housing, but with lots of heat-absorbing asphalt and little cooling vegetation. Frontline communities were next to factories, were next to oil refineries, which cause much air pollution and noise of the communities who lived there. There's a very important environmental sociologist, Robert D. Bullard, who wrote the famous book Dumping in Dixie in 1990. He was a professor, is a professor, author, activist, and environmental sociologist, and has exposed and made clear to many private as well as public figures and organizations how city planning has affected in the most negative way communities of color. Dr. Bullard was once told, as he said in his book Dumping in Dixie, that the words environment and racism didn't belong together because the environment couldn't be racist. The publisher who eventually bought the book made it into a textbook. Dr. Bullard realized that he was getting adopted by universities nationwide and affecting studies and development of cities and changing this legacy, negative legacy of environmental racism, starting with redlining. Dr. Ballard said, I discovered from the 30s up until 1978 that in looking at specific cities that 5 of city-owned landfills were in Black neighborhoods. 6 out of the 8 city-owned incinerators were in Black neighborhoods. 3 out of 4 privately owned landfills are in Black neighborhoods, even though Blacks only made up 25% of the population during that period. In 2021, Dr. Bullard became a White House advisor in the Biden administration, and he had a grant from Houston Endowment and the Bezos Earth Fund and Texas Southern University, and opened the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice. He used the GI Bill and went on to get a master's degree and doctorate in sociology, and emerged determined to model his career on the famous writer, intellectual, civil rights champion W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. Bullard said, Dr. Du Bois didn't do white man sociology. He did what I call kick-ass sociology. You can be a scholar and an activist, and you can do something to make change. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote his masterful study on Reconstruction. W.E. Du Bois is famous for many works, and his studies in sociology in Philadelphia and other places early in the century, and most particularly his analysis and history of Reconstruction, post-Civil War Reconstruction in America, which until then, many historians blame the failure of Reconstruction, which was the bureau to help former slave families get ahead, the Freedmen's Bureau, which ended in 1877 as Northern troops withdrew from the South and allowed the former Confederate leaders, racists, regain control of their local legislatures, counties, and cities, and begin the period of Jim Crow and terrible racial separation akin to slavery. So Dr. Bullard explains how W.E. Du Bois, in his writings, really reinterpreted Reconstruction and explained that it was not the fault, as was stated earlier, of blacks in destroying the Freedmen's Bureau. It was the cause of the reemergence of racism in the South and in the North. So part of the environmental policies of the Biden administration was an environmental justice effort and funding for that. It's questionable whether that will continue under the Trump administration. One of the things we'd like to look at is the city of Miami and how zoning decisions affected a very vibrant African-American community that thrived in downtown Miami in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s until decisions were made principally by the federal government, endorsed by local government, to build through this vibrant, intact black community a interstate highway, I-95, which destroyed most of the buildings who had to be knocked down and destroyed this community. The area of Miami that we're talking about is in downtown Miami. It's called Overtown. I grew up in Miami. I'm quite familiar with that area. In fact, my late father, David Probinski, was the manager and owner of one of the largest African-American black hotels in Overtown during this period. As a child of 12, 13 years old, in 1963, 64, I had the opportunity to go to the Sir John Hotel in Overtown and see some of the most famous black entertainers of the time. Henry Flagler built the railroads down the coast of Florida and all the way to Key West, had many black laborers. And so there was an area of downtown Miami that was designated for it was a matter of hundreds of people, of men and their families who worked on the railroad and needed a place to live and to settle. So this area in downtown Miami called Overtown was built and developed into one of the best black communities in the South. It was considered a little Broadway because of so many theaters, clubs, social organizations that were there. Overtown had many churches, community centers. It thrived. There were 50,000 residents there in the 1960s. It had many black-owned businesses, from nightclubs, black lawyers, doctors. In Miami, in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, black entertainers who came down to play on Miami Beach, which was white, play in the big hotels and clubs on Miami Beach, especially in the 50s and early 60s, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Cab Calloway, Josephine Baker, Nat King Cole. They played in the Fontainebleau hotels, the Eden Rock hotels. But where did they stay at night? Miami Beach was segregated. It was white. So they came to Overtown and stayed in the prominent, really luxury black hotels in Overtown, including the Mary Elizabeth Hotel and the Sir John Hotel that was owned by my father, David Probinski. Besides the entertainers who played on Miami Beach and stayed in these hotels in Overtown, a lot of folks who visited the hotels were prominent blacks, nationally, internationally. W.E.B. Du Bois, Zora Neale Hurston, famous African-American writer, Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson, famous athletes. At the Sir John Hotel's famous Night Beat Club were many famous black entertainers of the late 50s and early 60s. As a child of 12, 13 years old, I was able to go to the Saturday matinees when kids were allowed. I saw Count Basie, Sarah Vaughan, Brooke Benton, Ike and Tina Turner. At that time, they were called the Turner family. Sam and Dave, Flip Wilson, Nina Simone. Also who played there was B.B. King. The Sir John's Night Beat was frequented by black and white audiences. The famous black entertainers would come at night and they'd relax and stay at the Sir John, the Mary Elizabeth, and other hotels where some of the best black entertainers played to mixed audiences. In the 1960s, the federal government, with the consent of the county and city of Miami, decided to place I-95 interstate highway through the heart of Overtown, through the heart of this vibrant black community in downtown Miami. It caused the destruction of many homes and businesses. The population was decimated, went from 50,000 to just 10,000. It became economically destitute and was later considered a ghetto. So this area, formerly known as Little Broadway, hundreds of black-owned communities, dentists, law offices, restaurants, laundries, beauty salons, drugstores. There were wide and brick stucco homes with 2 stories, large front porches. These belonged to Black Miami's professional class. As the interstate highway destroyed and displaced this thriving black community, it really fell into a ghetto with few people there, high crime in the late 60s, early 70s. And it really wasn't until the 90s that some blacks in Miami, some intellectuals, teachers decided to try to rebuild parts of Overtown and to reclaim some of the prominent buildings and art centers, which they did, in particular the Lyric Theater. The Sir John, unfortunately, was torn down and became a site for U.S. Post Office distribution center. In particular, Dorothy Fields, who came from a very prominent black family in Miami, had the idea in the 1980s and to recover, to reclaim the history of Black Miami, of Overtown. She started the Black History Museum and revitalized the Lyric Theater, one of the prominent places in Overtown. Dr. Fields received documents and photographs from my family. It's now called the David Probinski Memorial Collection in the Black Archives. There's now a folklife village that's been rebuilt in Overtown, and there's tours that are available for folks to come in and see exactly what the prominence and how Overtown sparkled in its early years, and to recover a lot of that history and to celebrate it. The vibrant black community in Miami was devastated by environmental injustice, particularly the planning decisions of putting the interstate through it, which destroyed what's really called Broadway of the South. But there are folks who are working to revitalize it and remember it.